Michigan Transfer Agreement Info for Community College Math Departments with Jack Rotman. This presentation is sponsored by the Innovative Teaching and Learning Committee of AMATYC. AMATYC is the American Mathematical Association of two-year colleges, and our core value is building expertise and exhibiting leadership in the teaching and learning of mathematics, enhancing personal growth, and improving teaching methods and effectiveness as a personally initiated lifelong responsibility. And for more information, please visit our website at amatyc.org. And also, please note that the views expressed by the presenter are not necessarily the views of AMATYC, and any commercial products mentioned by the presenters are not endorsed by AMATYC. So now we're going to switch to the presenter slides. So let me bring those up, and then I'll turn it over to Jack. So if you could please let Jack know in the chat room that you are here, and I'll turn over to Jack now. Thank you.
Well, thank you everybody for signing up today. I hope you can hear me decently. If you lose me during the webinar, just pop that note in the comment and I'll try to fix it somehow. I want to share some information. I hope to have a lot of time for questions and answers as we go through this time together. So if you have questions, get them in there and we'll take care of them. Get you the best information we can. So this is a brief outline of what I thought we could go through today. Quickly, what is the MTA, talk about what the gen ed requirements are, how it's being implemented, and more time on the math pathways, and a couple of questions about intermediate algebra, and I've got a chart showing the courses normally in each pathway. So hopefully this outline matches somewhat with what you thought you were getting into with this webinar. If not, we can adjust later on to cope with things that you want to have covered. So let's get started. Well, if you don't know, the MTA is a Michigan thing for transfer between community colleges and universities. Well, the state legislature included some language about this in budget laws. The macro agreement helped with the same goal, but was not quite as uniformly used as we would like. So the MTA is an attempt to fix that. It was developed by a task force representing universities and community colleges with some membership from the legislature and state offices. So a little bit more about that, this general education part. If you're from Michigan, you know the macro agreement had some categories, and these will look a little bit familiar, but with some critical differences. And in case of mathematics, we used to be lumped in with the science. You could take 2 science courses or a science and math combination. Currently, with MTA, they will have to take a math course. So that's the focus of our time together, is what does that mean for us in Michigan? So we'll talk about how that's being described in a minute. The implementation of MTA is being done by the macro group, which is the collegiate registrar and admissions officers. Those acronyms always get me. Future budgets will have some performance funding based on the MTA, though that's unclear exactly how that's going to work. There's a web address on this screen where you can get all the documentation you'd ever want for the MTA. They've got the math task force posted there that we'll be using in this session, as well as some other documents on how it's going to be implemented. Some of the material that I've got in the webinar came from that site. So I recommend you go there for questions. Again, if you have questions today, make sure you pop them in there so we can get those addressed. The MTA math requirement is listed in terms of pathways, which is a little confusing since there's one course required. It's not a pathway that's required. The word pathway is designed to emphasize that different students should be thinking about different courses. So these are the pathways: college algebra, statistics, or quantitative reasoning. The MTA also says any more advanced course in these areas would also be accepted. And in the case of college algebra, we had to specifically say that calculus was included in that pathway, even though it's not a college algebra thing. It's part of the same sequence. So on the bottom of this, it talks about, math course should be treated as entry-level college course if they have to demonstrate MathStream Algebra 1 or equivalent content prior to enrollment. And this created a little confusion relative to intermediate algebra that we'll clarify later on. So these are the three basic pathways, and we'll talk about what each one means. And again, I'm hoping that we have a lot of time to do with any questions you have to clarify things. We want to make sure we get your needs met. So the college algebra pathway says specifically it must be beyond intermediate algebra. The task force that met this past year describes some topics that should be in such a course, and that task force report is posted at that macro website. I don't want to try to go through all of those, but people thought this was the typical content of a college algebra class. It's not necessarily the same as pre-calculus, but could be. We reference the MAA crafty guidelines for college algebra as a way to try to encourage us to get some uniformity in the state of what college algebra meant. And of course, other courses in the calculus path also count in this pathway. The word pathway is there because we want students to be thinking about this pathway if they're in a STEM program or a related field, not for people in, say, a social science. They should be going someplace else. So I'm wondering if people have questions right now with this college algebra pathway, or if this is making sense. See if Fred is typing something. Hopefully my answer will help. Is that a long question, Fred, or just taking a little bit of time? Okay, there we are. Oh, it varies a lot in Michigan too. I think some of us include exponentials and logs in intermediate algebra. Michigan has the usual variety. We don't have a state system to dictate the content of that class, so there's quite a bit of variety. We've had in Michigan, we've had a MichMATYC committee on algebra that tried to set some guidelines, but did not achieve a lot of success. So I hope that helps. So let's go on. Well, any other questions that come up, we'll go on. Oh, what's beyond intermediate algebra? That's a good question. The Michigan system depends on a lot of collaboration between institutions. A transfer is the biggest single thing. If, of course, transfers is college algebra, it's college algebra, whatever the title is. So that's the main way we know what's beyond intermediate algebra, if it transfers to something higher. The statistics pathway is essentially one course after beginning algebra, algebra 1, or comparable course. So some of us in Michigan are doing a mathematical literacy course that would qualify as a prerequisite to such a stat class. Students need to apply algebra skills in this pathway. And in the documentation, you'll see that it's supposed to be taught by math faculty or cross-listed with the math department. The thought here is people did not want a stat class taught by business faculty to be used as this gen ed requirement. And we specifically listed inferential statistics here so that a course that did just descriptive would not qualify. If you're familiar with this, the GAZE assessment standards is the guidelines for introductory statistics. It's not a content standard so much as assessments. So, again, if you have questions, go ahead and type them in. the statistics pathways have not been such a big thing in Michigan as other parts of the country. So Bert's asking about college algebra, colleges requiring basic algebra for statistics. Not so much. There's some of each. There's a few universities that do, some that don't. Here at Lansing Community College, we've got one of each. We have an introstat class after a basic algebra class and another one that would follow college algebra for different purposes. I notice that Steve is typing. Steve is doing a lot of work in statistics. Well, Steve is asking about inferential, including hypothesis testing. The brief answer, yes. Yeah, you're right. Any other questions about statistics? Okay, so let's come on. We can always come back to any of these pathways with questions later on. The third pathway is called quantitative reasoning. And this has the same prerequisites possibly as the statistics. And again, students have to apply algebra skills. The thought here is this is a course that comes from multiple math domains. The typical one blends algebra, statistics, and some other things, like you see listed here. There's a lack of uniformity in this course, both in the state and across the country. So we listed the guidelines from the Kentucky General Education Program as a way to kind of benchmark this course. To me, it's the least defined of the three. It's also the one that I think is the most applicable to a typical student in their general education requirements. It's the one that I see preparing students for basic science classes, for example, more than the statistics one. So any questions about this QR pathway? So Steve got a question there or something. Oh, in terms of using this QR course as a prerequisite to other courses, it hasn't been talked about. That's kind of a separate issue from the MTA work on Gen Ed. Let's wait another minute here and then we'll go on. I haven't heard too much about people retrofitting their finite courses so much as retrofitting other courses. Well, like one for QR, people are talking about adjusting it to meet these requirements. Let's go on. We can come back to any of these if we need to. Well, in the math task force that met this last year, we specifically said that intermediate algebra would not count for Gen Ed, which is a change in Michigan. Well, so intermediate algebra has no role in the MTA itself. MTA does not deal with institutional requirements for programs. So a college could still use any course they want for an associate's degree, including intermediate algebra, that would not be part of the MTA. The intent is to get a college-level math course required for general education instead of intermediate algebra. Michigan is unique in this situation because intermediate algebra in most states is defined to be remedial or developmental and therefore not eligible for a program. Michigan leaves the course in a limbo state where it can be used. So in the past, it's been used in a number of places, and that's going to be phasing out. Any questions about this part, intermediate algebra? Okay, so One thing I thought I could do is share a typical list of courses in each pathway. This is partially a reflection of what we did here at Lansing when we went through this review, but partially not. The first column, the college algebra pathway, is exactly what we submitted and approved for our MTA math requirements. The second one is what we have. We've got those two courses. What's different here is in the QR pathway, we only have the first course. And one of the things that is a concern is our math for elementary teachers was judged not to be qualifying in the QR pathway, which means students that are going to get a BS, BA in elementary teaching will need to take another math class besides our math for elementary teachers, whether it's college algebra, statistics, or QR. That's not a good outcome for me, but it's what's happening here. But at other colleges, you might use that math for elementary teachers as a QR course. So you may have questions about this chart. It may be the most important thing that we're doing today. So go ahead and type those questions in. Even if we have multiples, we'll get to them. Well, Louis is asking about our math for elementary teachers course. Like many Michigan colleges, we have two. And my hope was that the combination would be judged strong enough for the QR course. It's because the QR standards involve comparison of modeling. Doesn't say statistics, but it's that kind of thinking. And our courses don't do that. It also doesn't involve much algebra. That was the main thing that went wrong here. So Fred is asking about how difficult it is to switch from one path to the other. Clearly, if a student's going from statistics to QR, there's not much of a problem because they have the same prerequisite. Going from one of those to the college algebra could involve an extra course, depending on the student. So, and Jan, I wonder too, but there are those descriptions of what should be in a QR course that is in the math task force report, and the college judged that it did not meet those requirements enough, even though it's beyond beginning algebra. This is a little different for us because we're used to courses, all courses after a certain level being qualifying. That's not the way that the MTA is working. Yeah, John, I don't know as much about the new test. I've heard about it, but I don't know as much about it as you do. So Jan is asking who would judge. Oh, this is something that Michigan did with macro and is doing the MTA. The original review is internal within each college. That result is then sent to macro and reported on your website, and there's no further review of or vetting of that result unless problems come up. So if your college judges math for elementary teachers as a QR course, that's what will happen. Yeah, so see, I trust your judgment on that, on the elementary teachers course. It's a course that I don't happen to teach. See, the pre-test you're talking about is the elementary basic skills test that potential teachers have to take? Okay. So John, asking about a geometry course. Geometry is not listed separately. You'd have to fit that into a QR situation. It's certainly not college algebra, it's certainly not statistics, so the only pathway left is QR. So you'd have to have a geometry course that included enough other material to be qualifying. Certainly a straightforward geometry course would not qualify, unless it's part of the college algebra pathway. I don't think we offer such a thing in Michigan. But that's what I said, Lois. The review is definitely being done internally within each institution. If your institution judges it strong enough to qualify for the QR pathway, and it transfers to the accepting university, they will accept it, as I understand it, for the QR. It'll be for the math requirement. The MTA will not stamp each one as being a QR, statistics, or college algebra pathway. The students will just get a MTA stamp. But there's an issue with transfer that I want to talk about. In fact, I want to move to that slide, and I'll come back to this one. The last slide is other points. When the MTA process was started, the intent was to have a block transfer of general education credits, the 30 credits. With the macro agreement, we had many provisos. Universities would accept macro for general education except for 3 areas, and require students to do their version of general education in those 3 areas. MTA was supposed to avoid that. Hold on a second. So MTA was supposed to avoid the provisos. However, as the macro group is implementing it, they're still allowing universities to not accept it if they don't have an equivalent course. So in the case of QR, several Michigan universities don't have a QR course. So if a student uses a QR here at LCC and transfers to Michigan State, it will not be counting for MTA. It's for them as they transfer. To me, that's a confusing thing, and I hope that gets adjusted in the long term. So that's part of what we're getting into with the QR thing for elementary teachers. And this page has some other information too that probably doesn't affect math as much as overall MTA. I'm going to click back to the other side, and if we can go back here if you have a question on it. So, what other questions do you have on these pathways? One thing I'll mention while Jan is typing, the math task force that developed these final recommendations was a blend of community college faculty from MichMATYC, our affiliate, and the MAA state affiliate, Michigan MAA, along with a few other folks who met a few times to develop the requirements. So what other questions do you have? I don't have a good answer for your question, Jan. I've tried to get more definitive things from macro as they implement this. If they are leaving a lot up to the receiving institution in terms of accepting credit, their current approach is if the credit is not accepted, like a math course accepted as credit, it would not be accepted there to meet general education. I think this will be a problem. But universities that currently have a QR course, like Eastern Michigan, for example, they will not have any problem. There'll be students going to a university that does not have anything like this who will have difficulty. The other difficulty I'm aware of is in statistics, students can use an intro stat class that has a beginning algebra prerequisite for MTA, but the receiving institution may judge that course not appropriate for transfer, which kind of blocks those students from counting it at that institution. So what other questions do we have about pathways or concerns? In a way, Jan, I agree with you. I was hoping for something better. I do think this is an improvement for students compared to macro. Hopefully we can all support the idea of having a separate math requirement, separate from science. The issues here will do with universities that don't have a QR course or won't accept an intro stat class with a lower prerequisite than they've had. So Steve, I'm confused by your question. And who teaches the QR and CA pathways? The MTA task force on math did not have anything about who's teaching outside of statistics being taught by math faculty. Yeah, that's the only part I'm aware of. There's not a similar statement for college algebra or QR. The presumption there is those are only taught by math departments. So Mark's question there is basically saying the MTA still has provisos. It doesn't void the MTA overall. It just creates a black hole that students can walk into going to certain institutions. So the macro plan for implementing this says students need to talk to advisors about whether the receiving institution will accept that particular course at transfer. And that part is exactly like has been the case with the macro agreement in the past. My own hope is that, over time the MTA will become more a block transfer than it is right now. Right now it's supposed to be block transfer, but it's not working out totally that way. The math for elementary teachers being taught by TE folks is mostly, I think, a university scenario. Haven't seen too many community colleges where the teachers' ed course is taught by TE faculty. Usually don't have that kind of thing going on. Well, Mark is asking about the name. This is one of my concerns. We've got a lot of confusion about what QR is and a lot of inconsistency in names. In the listing here you see liberal arts math. The historical course with that name is not a QR course. It's a survey and enjoyment of math for people that don't need to do any math at all. And that's not actually a QR course. Some of those courses have been updated so they are. But I would prefer them to be called quantitative reasoning. And so, Steve, your comment there makes me think that maybe the Math for Elementary Teachers course should be conceived of as a QR course in the first place, rather than a methods course. So what other questions or concerns do we have? As you can tell, you're saying that I don't have all the answers. Some of these things are just as confused. So what other questions or concerns do we have? So, Mark, your question about QR being a prerequisite for a STEM pathway, that's certainly not the intent. The intent that there be alternatives very separate from each other. A given student could make a transition from one to the other, but taking a course or two in between. They're conceived of as being separate things. Now, trigonometry is dealt with differently at different institutions in Michigan. At some of our colleges, trigonometry is part of a college algebra sequence, and there wouldn't be a separate course that is only trigonometry, but that would be considered of as a college algebra pathway course in most situations. Especially if you have like a college algebra prerequisite for your trig course. What other questions, concerns do we have? It looks like Jerry was starting to type something. I can't see if he's still doing it or not. Mark, you're talking about intermediate algebra. In the recent past, the course has been perhaps distracted. Originally, it was just for students going on to college algebra or pre-calculus. It's been used by a lot of students as their terminal math class. I think that's likely to shift, and I think that's good news. Here at Lansing, we've got well over half our students who take intermediate algebra in that situation. It's the last math course they're going to take, which makes it really difficult to do a good job preparing them for the STEM fields, the STEM pathway. I think it's going to make the intermediate algebra course more focused on a purpose in life. I think that's a good thing. So Steve, you talk about having a new course for people that are going on to more math, but keeping the old intermediate algebra course for those who don't need anything else. It's a little different than we're doing. Here at Lansing, we're hoping that more students take our QR course and statistics course and not take our intermediate algebra unless they need to go on to the college algebra pathway. Well, this falls in the category that John mentioned at the start about commercial materials. Coincidentally, we're using the Bennett and Briggs book. We've looked at the Sobecki book. They're very similar textbooks. There are a couple other decent choices too. Oh, yes, I can see why you do that, Steve. Oh, about performance funding, I'll go back there. Here. This is all very vague. The only thing that's been there so far is a statement anticipating that future budgets will have performance funding based on how universities especially accept the MTA. I'm not sure how it's going to be judged, what the formulas would look like or anything. I just know it's been a statement in the legislation so far that this is coming. That's about all I know. That's all anybody knows right now. The legislature's still got to work through what they really meant by that. This is at Beit-Enoch, a full college level QR course. This sounds like what we call our mathematical literacy course here at LCC. I know a couple other colleges are doing it also. There's similar things going on with the Dana Center's New Mathways project. They have a course called Foundations of Mathematical Reasoning, which is the same kind of content as the Math Lit course that we do. So I think the answer is yes. I think there are other people doing that. And that course is being used as a prerequisite for Introstat, the QR course, the liberal arts math course, and similar things. Yeah, so that's interesting. We might want to hear more about that. Yeah, Jackson's got a history of working on the stat pathway in particular, the modified algebra course that feeds into the statistics course. It's an alternative to what we're doing with our Math Lit course. So one of the questions I've heard other places is the QR pathway. There's this course called Mathematical Literacy, and people have asked whether the Math Lit course would qualify, and the answer there is definitely not. So Scott's talking about one of these Math Lit courses, which I'd heard about this. I think it's great. Your course will be a lot like ours. I'm going to go back to that slide with the courses. Well, the transfer question, Jan, is about the QR course, not the Math Lit course. The developmental course is not the transfer issue. I think over the next few years, most universities will have a QR course. I think that's one impact the MTA will have in the long term. I think we're in a transition period now where some universities won't have it, and it'll cause some problems for a while for students. But in the long term, they will have one. They might even be willing to let their own students take it. So Scott, WSU is Wayne State. We have not checked with them about our course. Being in Lansing, not many of our students go there. So I'm not familiar with that one myself. The best thing I'd suggest there is go to the Michigan Transfer Network website and see what they say about Wayne State. So Lois, I agree with some of what you're saying. The problem is that none of those really have a standardized curriculum in Michigan. Somebody talked about in one of our task force meetings, everybody knows what college algebra means. I laughed because I still see a lot of variation in what we call college algebra. Statistics is a little bit better off, but I think there's still inconsistency there. But it's true that the QR pathway is less uniform, and we could use some professional work on what we mean by that. You know, your situation, Jan, where it only transfers, the QR course only transfers to private liberal arts schools, that's a little unusual. Ours, we don't know how much it transfers to the private colleges, but it does transfer to EMU, as Scott's course does, as well as a few others. You might be right, John. The textbook seems to drive a lot of our curricular work. So Jane, you're asking about the book that John's using. I think it's called Everyday Math. I could be wrong. When I've looked at it, oh, okay, that's still an alternative. Yeah. The Coleman materials are not exactly a textbook as much as a set of resources and lessons. It's been around for a while. Certainly one of the problems with the QR is there are several books, but it's not a big market, so there's not a lot of strong interest from publishers to develop resources around them. I'm hoping that will change partly as a result of MTA. What other questions do you have? Concerns? Or information you want to share? John, I'll let you answer that one about the webinar materials. I think the webinar recording does capture this chat as well. So, Jan, you're asking a different MTA for each university? No, it's a transfer decision with each institution. If the receiving institution doesn't take your QR course, then it will, as I understand the way they're doing it, it will not work for Gen Ed. So it's a transfer question more than an MTA question. I was hoping that would be eliminated, but from what I can see in the macro materials, it's not. So for Paul's question, we don't have a graph theory class. I'd be curious to hear what kind of students take that class. My guess is the graph theory is a pretty unusual class for a community college to have. So Janet, the way I'd phrase it is, it's an advising issue. If a student is going to MSU, the advisors need to know that all students going to MSU need to follow the college algebra pathway no matter what their program is, which that conflicts with how we'd like this to work, but it's how it's being implemented right now. So one of the things that I recommend you do is talk to your advising program and to see what they've been told to tell students about math and MTA. They're in the process of getting their training in this spring. That's interesting. I don't know what ASM stands for. Jan, I know what you mean. I think I'd say the MTA works differently with different receiving institutions because of the way this is being implemented. So given the requirement for course transfer for it to work, well, there are going to be advising issues. So we've got a few minutes left if you have other questions or concerns. Otherwise, we'll wrap up in a couple minutes. So, John, does that mean we're done?
No, that doesn't actually mean that we're done quite yet, but I can actually read through these slides and see if anyone else has any questions after that.
Okay.
So thanks again for participating in today's AMATYC webinar. And if you'd like to support future AMATYC webinars, please consider becoming a member of AMATYC at bit.ly/join-AMATYC. And please remember to like AMATYC on Facebook at facebook.com/AMATYC. And recordings of past AMATYC webinars can be found at bit.ly/AMATYC-webinars, and it typically takes us 1 to 2 weeks to produce and upload webinars to this archive. And please take 2 minutes to evaluate the webinar content and the presenter today at bit.ly/AMATYC19. And if you need an email confirmation of your participation in this webinar, please fill in the optional section at the end of the evaluation. And if you have any more questions, please put them in the chat room. And can we all thank Jack for his time today as well?
Fudge and other presents gladly accepted. Yeah, I appreciate your being here and sharing information today as well as asking questions. If you have questions after we get done, feel free to send me an email. I'll be glad to try to do what I can to give you an answer. I appreciate it. So, any other questions today?
Okay, well, it doesn't look like there are any more questions today, so I'm actually going to end the recording right now.